Hello, everyone. So I'm super sleepy. For some reason, I decided to, when I usually wake up at some point in the middle of the night, but I just decided to get up and do dishes and then pace my apartment. So I eventually went back to sleep, but yeah, and then allergies are crazy. So sorry if I look crazy. Let's see. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to go through the Magna Moralia, which there's some question about whether or not this is actually written by Aristotle or one of his, like, I don't know, maybe disciples or sympathizers, etc. I think most people think it's not necessarily written by him, or it is like a less mature work. For myself, I think that it sounds pretty much like Aristotle. So, and I think it's helpful. So I know that a lot of you are maybe needing some extra help. So this is a video for that purpose. So let's just do a close reading as much as we can in one video to at least get you started, because this is what I want to talk about tomorrow in class. So, and I will also, am happy to do this in class, do a close reading. So yeah. Okay, since our purpose is to speak about ethics, we must first inquire of what moral character is a branch. So, first you could just ask, well, what's the difference between ethics and morality? To speak concisely, then, it would seem to be a branch of nothing else than statecraft. So this has been mentioned by Plato as well, that politics is really the realm, like the realm of the most valuable good. It's most important to draw a line between morality, ethics, and politics. And we have to remember in Greek culture, politics comes from the polis. So it is, it's identifying something that's maybe bigger than our idea of politics. We think of politics, I think most of us in the US as like the government and government laws, etc. Like to be a politician is to, be kind of in the public eye in a sense and have maybe ascribed to particular ideologies. But the polis was really a place where every voting member of society would come to like talk things out. And so it really included, yeah, so like more people, like, and it has to do with how you're structuring society and structuring culture. And it really like the main question of politics for the ancient Greeks was how to live, how do we live the best life? How do we live the good life? What is the good life? And so I think this harping on politics is really saying that, well, one, that there needs to be in voting members, in the leaders and the guardians, for Plato, the philosopher kings, the leaders of the affairs of the state, which we talked about, like what the state might mean. Like Hegel talks about the state, and it means also maybe more than government. That those people need to be of like the highest reason, logic, and also like promoting these virtues that Plato and Aristotle and others find so important. But Plato thought, we don't have that. That's why he wrote the Republic. His whole Republic was based on a critique of what was going on at the time, which was Athenian democracy. And he actually was talking through the whole thing about, well, he was trying through the whole of the Republic, sorry, sleepy, to convince Glaucon, who was in a political position, kind of edging on being a tyrant, to not be a politician, because there wasn't really a place for philosopher kings at that time. So that's why the Republic is a utopia. For it is not possible to act at all in affairs of state unless one is of a certain kind. So there you go. To wit, good. Now to be, because if you don't have these philosopher kings, these people who ascribe to the good and seek after the good, it's not a true polis. It's not true politics, because the true, whatever it is the highest and captures the essence. So now we're defining it a little more specifically. Now to be good is to possess the virtues. All right, so what is a virtue? Well, you can just look at the examples that Plato and Aristotle give us. So for instance, like temperance could be a virtue, courage is a virtue. So if you think about or honesty, truthfulness is a virtue. So if you think about virtues as sort of character traits that are admirable and that help us navigate sort of social relations and the world, and thinking about, well, what is a person that has like a good character? They've developed their character, right? It wouldn't be someone who's like necessarily cowardly, who's afraid of everything, right? That keeps you from navigating lots of areas of life. It's not going to be someone who's like always dishonest, because then like how can you trust that person? And then what was the other one? Oh, temperance. So someone who is even-minded, it's going to be difficult if you are like a rash person and you kind of go from one extreme to the other in your sort of reactions or, your decisions, etc. So being temperate is kind of like taking the middle way. So, and everyone has their list of virtues that they think are most important. And that's why I said in class, it's a really good idea if you want to start to know yourself and direct your life more intentionally, to figure out, what are the 10 virtues, the 5 to 10 virtues that you think are most important for you. Plato really said, okay, these are my virtues. And now we need to restructure society. So, everyone can achieve them to some level. Or at least not obstruct those who are trying to achieve them. But, we kind of saw, or maybe I hopefully expressed to you, that when we try to superimpose our ideas of what is good for a person on other people, can kind of get us into like a tricky place, some benevolent dictatorship. If therefore one is to act successfully in affairs of the state, one must be of good moral character. I mean, I think, many people would agree with that, right? We don't want immoral people being in leadership. A lot of times that's why, who said it? Yeah, it was Plato in the Republic. He said that, there shouldn't be any intense like reward or like alluring temptation for people to be in politics. Like actually those who are philosopher kings or even guardians, they're going to eat together. They're not going to really own anything. They're not going to get like this big salary. So because you don't want to attract the wrong people into politics. And I think to a certain measure, we have that in the US. Yes, there's like the White House that the president, say, gets to live in. But I don't think the salary is just like insane. Maybe the perks, like add to that or something. But it's hard, it's stressful. Like saw Obama at the end of like his reign in the White House in that position. Like every president like comes in looking a lot more fresh than they do leaving. And it's just because there's, it's not a 9 to 5 job. It's so stressful. You're getting all of these pressures from within the government and from without, like, and I think for like people like lower in the hierarchy in government, they have like said that, it's not going to necessarily make you rich. Now, a lot of, I think, American politicians, or some, go into it with a lot of money, but if you don't come from a lot of money and you go into politics, it's not going to be alluring. Maybe people already who are rich, like, are interested in government for like the power, because it does give you, I guess, like status and power. But Plato in the Republic said we should make this job as like least tempting as possible so people will get into it for the right reasons. I think actually like that happens in teaching as well. Like professors, especially like community college professors, which I am, or people who are just teaching part-time, we are, you know, if we don't have like a partner with a second income, we are living paycheck to paycheck for sure. And that's why most of us are probably teaching more than we should. Um, Dividing our attention is not necessarily good for students, or ourselves and our own well-being, but it's kind of what you have to do. But so people who want to teach don't do it for the money. They do it because they love it. And that's kind of a good thing. I think that that's what keeps a lot of times the academic space kind of pure and innocent, So I'm not having to advertise my class or be like use manipulative tactics to get people in. I know that if a class is created and I'm assigned to teach it, like for the most part, it'll run and that'll be that. So, okay. The treatment of moral character then is, as it seems, a branch and starting point of statecraft. And as a whole, it seems to me that the subject oughtly right to be called not ethics, but politics. So that's a really intense statement, right? Let's not even call it ethics. Let's call it politics, because politics is supposed to be like the space of the highest good and the highest ethics. We must therefore, as it seems, first say about virtue both what it is and from what it comes. So Aristotle very much wants to create categories. For it is perhaps of no use to know virtue without understanding how or from what it is to arise. So Aristotle wants to know the first principle of it. We have a goal, right? We want to be virtuous. So what is virtue? And then how do we get it? We must not limit our inquiry to knowing what it is, but extend it to how it is to be produced. For we wish not only to know, but also ourselves to be such. So this is like a personal kind of goal. Okay. And this will be impossible for us unless we know from what and how it is to be produced. So we're being very methodical here, which might be kind of, because we're so exacting, this is part of perhaps what makes reading this frustrating to students. Okay, I always forget where I leave off. Of course, it is indispensable to know what virtue is, for it is not easy to know the source and manner of its production. If one does not know what it is any more than in the sciences, but we ought to be aware also of what others have said before us on this subject. So, if you didn't really want to If you just want to know what Aristotle thinks and not, his critiques of others, then you could, skip this part. And part of reading philosophy, I think, in an introductory intro to philosophy class is you're always going to be limited on time, even if you get 20 pages to read. Philosophy is not something that you read once and then you kind of understand it. So because of the finite nature of, a college class and a week where you are discussing like this and probably other readings, it's okay to, skip something for now if you don't have the time, and hopefully you come back to it later. But we're not going to skip it because it will add to our understanding if we read what Aristotle is contrasting himself with. Pythagoras first attempted to speak about virtue, and if you're interested in Pythagoras, if you look at Ovid's Metamorphoses, he has like a whole poem about Pythagoras and those who follow him, like the dietary choices, and it's amazing. Okay, but not successfully. So he's talking about virtue, but not successfully. For by reducing the virtues to numbers, he submitted the virtues to a treatment which was not proper to them. For justice is not a square number. I feel like that's kind of like a, I don't know, like it's kind of being catty there a little bit. Ugh, like a toss of the hair. Justice isn't a square number. And I think this is almost, I mean, he's going to get to Plato, but I think this would be a critique for Plato as well, because I mean, you read the really complicated kind of like whirling concentric circles in the like last chapter of the Republic about reincarnation. So whenever Plato really wants to defend something, he just like skips to mathematics, which makes those people, those readers who are not mathematically inclined, as myself, kind of just like, I don't know, it's just hard to understand, right? I mean, I can't remember if it's Critias or the Timaeus, which gets pretty geometric, maybe both. But yeah, so this is, I mean, Plato was a Pythagorean sympathizer, I think. After him came Socrates, which is really interesting because Aristotle kind of indicates, or maybe one of his disciples or sympathizers indicates, that what Socrates thought and what Plato thought was pretty like clearly differentiated. And, because we don't have any extant writings of Socrates, maybe he didn't write anything at all. That's what some people kind of theorize. He's just kind of walking around, talking to people, not really focused or caring about writing anything. I don't know, like, did he write? He never wrote anything. I don't know. Like, I feel like that's super convincing, but it is hard for the modern reader to differentiate them because it's really just, well, it's not just Plato. Other people are talking about Socrates. But most people who are, not getting too deep into philosophy really just know Socrates from Plato's work. So where does Socrates end and Plato begin? So I think that this is a really interesting part. After him came Socrates, who spoke better and further about this subject, but even he was not successful, for he used to make the virtues sciences, which I think is an interesting critique because I see Aristotle as very scientific. But, in his methods and his exacting kind of categorizing. And I mean, he's certainly more scientific than Plato. I mean, Plato is like a literary dramatist, which makes his works like so enjoyable for more people, I think. For the sciences all involve reason. This is a really interesting departure from Plato as well. And reason is to be found in the intellectual part of the soul, because Aristotle is going to argue that there's something irrational about virtues, which I think is like really beneficial to how we think of maybe like emotions, because I think he said that because virtues have, because they deal with our intention and our state of mind and our emotional state. If emotions are irrational, usually then that gets like downplayed in like comparison to reason. Like reason is like the highest, right? But Aristotle is creating space for, irrationality, which might not be like the best word because it's so boggled down in negativity, right? Who wants to be irrational? But the emotional self is kind of reclaimed because, like, think about the virtue of temperance. Um, as it might relate to being super reactive and angry, like anger is an emotion, right? Or if you talk about like different passions, they're emotions. So it's really interesting that Aristotle is like observing this. So that all the virtues, according to him, are to be found in the rational part of the soul. The result is that in making the virtues sciences, he is doing away with the irrational part of the soul and is thereby doing away also both with passion and moral character. So being moral, you could ask yourself, this would be like a discussion question. What does morality have to do with passion or emotions? What do emotions or passionate emotions have to do with morality? If you want to be a moral person or an ethical person, how do your emotionals play into that? It's going to probably be hard to be moral or ethical, treat people in a fair and just way, not be tyrannical. It's going to be hard to do that if you are very emotionally immature and we get angry really easily, because then that's, maybe going to block being productive. It's maybe going to harm others because we're lashing out at them. So morality, in that sense, is really connected with emotions. Are emotions not reasonable? I mean, let's see if Aristotle kind of helps us make a connection between emotions and reason. But right now, he's trying to connect irrationality with virtues. Okay, so that he has not been successful in this respect in his treatment of the virtues. After this, Plato divided the soul into the rational and the irrational part. So Aristotle also divides the soul, which we'll see. And in this, he was right. So there you go. There's some agreement. Assigning appropriate virtues to each. So far, so good. Okay, that's interesting. So if Aristotle thinks that, so Aristotle kind of answered the question that I was asking, like, can't emotions be reasonable? Can't virtues be reasonable? Shouldn't we have reasonably crafted emotions? So yes, then there are virtues that are rational and there are virtues that are irrational, or, maybe like certain kinds of emotions. Maybe certain kinds of emotions are rational and certain kinds of emotion are irrational. But after this, he went astray, for he mixed up virtue with the treatment of the good, which cannot be right, not being appropriate. So this is where I think Aristotle gets, and other philosophers, like for hundreds and hundreds of years afterwards, become kind of unphilosophical in a sense, because to say something is appropriate, I don't know if that is helpful when we're trying to be logical. I mean, what does it mean to be appropriate? That sounds a bit moralistic to me and also subjective. And if we want to aim for, I know it's on a continuum, but if we want to aim for, more objectivity, we're trying to be logical, we're trying to be reasonable, not swayed by our biases, then like I think saying that it's not appropriate is not like does not convincingly end the conversation. I'm like, is it? I could disagree with that. So I don't know. For me, that's kind of a red flag whenever a philosopher says that. For in speaking, unless, I mean, of course, appropriate is the English translation. I don't know what it is in the Greek. Maybe there's some nuance to what is appropriate or not. Like that could all be argued. For in speaking about the truth of things, he ought not to have discoursed upon virtue, for there is nothing common to the two. So Aristotle is saying Plato conflates a lot of things, and he's mixing up virtue with the treatment of the good. I mean, right now, I think that's like a little confusing. Isn't, Aristotle saying that being virtuous, like, wouldn't virtuous be good? So Aristotle is saying that Plato shouldn't have talked about virtues. I think maybe this has to do with the forms and Aristotle's critique of the forms, because Plato's treatment of the good would equate to the treatment of the forms, which Aristotle doesn't think is important, even if forms do exist. Remember, forms for Plato are those kind of like essential ideas or energies that are manifest in the material world in various ways, but also in incomplete ways and imperfect ways. Like the material world is a shadow of what the form is, and the forms live in kind of this like uncorrupted, pure realm that we can only really fully revisit and remember when we are not in an incarnated on earth state. So after we die, we can return to the forms, which kind of sounds to me like a religious or spiritual kind of place, or I guess what am I trying to say? Oh, I guess form of source, like what the Gnostics are trying to go back to and remember. But for Plato, philosophy and seeking that, learning to be philosophical, a philosopher, can help your soul connect to that wisdom, even though it would still be like incomplete. You can connect to it more than you could if you were not taking that path of philosophy. So I think that, and Aristotle just doesn't think that the forms are like to seek them out or to talk about them. He feels like that's impractical because if you can't know it completely, and it's so hard to just even get like a hazy kind of understanding of it, like we really need to look at what the good is in our accessible material world. So in that sense, Plato is kind of characterized as being like more like romantic, and he's focused on the transcendent, where Aristotle is, Plato has his head in the clouds. Aristotle is grounded and he is going to deal with what's in front of him. And that's what he wants us to do. So he's not going to write, you know, a political utopia. The above mentioned then, so he's kind of, I guess, finished with his critiques, have touched upon the subject so far and in the way above described. It's like he usually also wants to talk about just like not even what these other philosophers are saying, but what is the general public view of the masses concerning like happiness or pleasure, to, you know, differentiate his own kind of theories and philosophies. The next thing, so he gives us like guideposts. He's very methodical. That's why I said like in someone's discussion post that you could, in writing this, like maybe even turn this into like an extended outline. So the next thing will be to see what we ought to say ourselves upon the subject. So I'm going to stop there. I just kind of wanted to give an example to everyone of like how slowly I go through a philosophical reading. It's pretty slow. And how much, like, just as I am like explaining this to you, I would be reading, like, this is helpful for me. You can also just have a conversation with yourself as if you are teaching or as if you are talking to yourself, talking the reading out. And that's why I said that it's okay if you, I mean, just in that, I could probably reflect on that for like 2 paragraphs, right? I could ask a discussion question about any of that I just read. And maybe that's all that you read. And you come to class and that's all that you read, but you can still have things to say about just these, you know, not even complete like 2 pages. But that's how slow I go. That's how much reflecting I would do on my own to really digest it. So what is it really saying? I have to contemplate, you know, what it's saying to help me understand what it is, you know. So, and then I might go back and reread it with that kind of working through in mind. And it's just the more time you spend with a reading, the more you're going to understand it. So don't sort of, you know, judge yourself or shame yourself like, oh, I read this, I couldn't understand it. This is too hard for me. Well, how much time did you really spend on it? And not just how much time, but how much quality time did you spend with it? How much time did you spend actually wrestling with it and having a conversation with it? So, of course, no one is going to be able to understand this unless you spend quality time with the reading, conversing with it. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. I'm gonna stop sharing because I think I have to. So yeah, so hopefully I don't think that took too much time, but it just kind of shows you what reading philosophy is. So I will see you in class tomorrow.